Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. What is up? Well, according to this story, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia is missing. Remember, this is the guy who threatened Tony Blair at number 10 Downing Street with another 7/7 bus bomb if he didn't call off the investigation into the Bandar BAE slush fund. Maybe Blair's new pals at J.P. Morgan will have the prince rubbed out. What else? General Motors zombie shares. General Motors is dead, but its shares are trading at $500 million. That's right, brokers on Wall Street are swapping shares back and forth amongst themselves to make commissions, even though the company is officially dead, as a way to defraud the American people and defraud the American economy. America is run by vampires and Goldman Sachs. Let's get the latest from political analyst Stacy Herbert. Stacy Herbert, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's good to be here, Max.
How are the Twitter wars doing? I noticed that we're having a Twitter war. I'm still winning the Twitter war.
I don't know. Why don't you check it out?
Let's check it out. Put the Twitter war up there.
Oh, look, it's over capacity.
Yeah, that's over capacity. That's right, the Twitter war. I'm winning the Twitter war. Follow me, Max Keiser, not Stacy Herbert.
Okay, Max.
Yes.
Now, I have not really a headline, but an assembly of a few videos. And this is regarding the Haitian, earthquake disaster and the follow-up. Here is President George W. Bush on CBS Face the Nation.
We want to be around to help on the rebuilding aspects of this. And the lesson I've learned on all the crises or catastrophes during my presidency was people want to help.
So, yes, as he said, he created so many disasters and crises during his own presidency, and he found that so many people always wanted to help, whether it's like the disaster he created in Iraq, or the disaster he created in Afghanistan, or the disaster he created in Katrina. So he feels like he is able to help. Now, look at this next cut.
Do they have any pretzels there?
Go to this next clip from Meet the Press.
I need to put a pitch in for the ClintonBushHaitiFund.org. One of my concerns around any crisis is that shysters show up and take advantage of people's goodwill and generosity.
So people want to help, and George Bush and Bill Clinton have created this website where you can donate. And he says that shysters tend to show up. Right after that, he says shysters want to show up. This man is, very simple, so you see what's operating in his mind of, we're not the shysters, you're the shysters. Who's the shyster?
Yeah, George Bush could be the new Billy Mays. I tell the director, I'll put this in the post, put a brief clip of Billy Mays doing his thing on the Home Shopping Network.
OxyClean, the stain specialist.
Yeah, that's Billy Mays. That could be George Bush in a couple of months.
Well, he might not know this, but the word shyster actually usually refers to either lawyers or politicians. So when he's trying to accuse NGOs and charities and other French people, maybe, that they're shysters, it actually tends to be politicians who are shysters.
Yeah, it's a good German word, shyster. It's like coprophagist, people who like to eat feces. That's where it comes from.
Now, if there is any shyster, I want you to look at this footage of these three presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. Now, they're announcing this rescue plan for Haiti. Now, check out Bush. See how he keeps on laughing inappropriately and not, swaying back and forth and jittering?
Yeah, he needs to change the batteries in his electric underwear. He's having some trouble there.
Here you have the three presidents of the United States, probably more responsible than even the French for destroying Haiti as what it is. And check out this headline, Haitians dying in hospital from lack of supplies. That's what happens when, of course, you have the United States in charge of the airport and allowing supplies through.
Well, look, Stacy Herbert, the United States economy is based on militarization and bad banking practices on Wall Street. So any opportunity they have to boost their militarization of the globe, they're going to take, regardless of what the politics is on the ground. They just send in the troops and start billing them right away.
They do send in the troops. They send in Blackwater and other private contractors. And these are the very same sort of people that are responsible for the missing billions in Iraq and Afghanistan, remember. And here's another reason not to donate to the Bush-Clinton Haiti Fund.
No, I'm not going to give their fund no money. Not me.
Well, it's likely to end up in Virginia somewhere in some private military contractors.
Yeah, Blackwater's pocket. You might as well just send a check out to Blackwater, now known as Z, and bypass the commission that those three guys, the three amigos, the three blind mice, are going to take for their own pockets.
The three amigos. Well, this takes me to the next headline. Did foreigners cause America's financial crisis?
Did foreigners cause America's financial crisis? Huh, okay. How does this one go?
Well, this is from Time magazine, and they're talking about Ricardo Caballero, who is the head of MIT's economics department. And he says this, quote, "Foreign investors created a demand for assets that was difficult for the U.S. financial sector to produce. All they wanted were safe assets, and their ensuing purchases made the U.S. unsafe."
Yeah, well, that is nonsense. You see, America and Wall Street created toxic debts and toxic packaged securities using what they call financial engineering, which is a euphemism for packaging garbage and selling it like it's something other than garbage, except people are not used to the idea that you can create financial garbage. They think that all of finances are clean and squeaky and that money is somehow pure in its own right. They don't understand that you can actually create toxic garbage and toxic derivatives by re-engineering money so that it performs like a virus. Once these banks in Europe, for example, got these American debts, the debts festered and they compounded their interest cost, and they put these banks at great disadvantage. This is part of the American methodology to expand the American imperium around the world, is by getting countries to swallow these toxic bonds manufactured by Paulson, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon, Tim Geithner, the whole list that we are familiar with of the toxic Avengers wielding toxic weapons of mass financial destruction.
Well, this follows on the Financial Crisis Committee meetings that are happening, and he's taking the opposite view of it. He's saying that Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America created these toxic, faulty, fraudulent derivative products because there was so much demand for yield. Because if it hadn't been for the savings of China and Saudi Arabia, he points out, and other foreign investors, if it hadn't been for their large pool of savings, these poor, innocent American bankers wouldn't have been forced to create fraudulent products.
Well, it's unconscionable. You know, a 2-year-old will eat until it causes itself severe physical damage, or a 2-year-old will eat toxic toys. You know, it's up to the manufacturer to have some responsibility. You can't say that, well, we live in a demand and supply marketplace. There was demand for toxic securities, so we simply filled the demand. And the fact that this totally destroyed the global economy, we don't want to take any responsibility for that, just because we manufactured the toxic securities to begin with. That's unconscionable.
Well, Max, actually, they were saying that there was a demand for yield. There wasn't a demand for toxic products, for fraudulent products that were going to blow up and destroy the wealth of the rest of the world. There was demand for yield.
Yeah.
And this is why he blames China. He says China used their massive sovereign wealth to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, thus driving down the yield. So other investors were forced to go looking for yield. So,
okay, let me explain how you create yield on a security. First of all, you can't get outside of the global what's called the yield spread, which is the spread between short-term and long-term fixed paper. Okay, that's the yield spread, and there is a natural boundary between a high yield and a low yield. If you're creating a toxic security with a greater than average yield, it's because you're claiming that this security is tied to an asset like a mortgage that has a certain performance expectations, which is false, and they got people like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch to sign off on the toxicity by giving these bonds greater ratings than they deserve. So they sold these things as having a high yield, even though that they had no expectation of paying down those mortgages whatsoever. You had people in America who were collateralizing a shack in a toxic waste dump and saying that was worth $1 million and has a 15% yield based on a collateralized debt obligation as being peddled by Goldman Sachs. And that's the yield that they're being sold to these foreign bankers who, of course, Moody's and S&P said, oh, yeah, we give it a high rating because they're on the take. Moody's is totally corrupt. S&P is totally corrupt, as are the investment banks, as are the analysts, as are the bankers who are packaging these securities. This is, Greenpeace should open up an office on Wall Street to monitor the toxicity of the financial environment. The financial environment is the most abused, toxic environment in the world. More toxic than the oceans, more toxic than the atmosphere is the financial environment. And you've got Geithner and Paulson and Goldman and J.P. Morgan. They're dumping their risk into this sludge, and they're trying to get people to eat it as if it's something worth eating when it's nothing more than poisonous. It's absolutely unconscionable, and as we've said on the show before, the question is what should be the suitable penalties for these terrorists?
Well, Ricardo Caballero gives all the bogus mortgage holders, the bogus mortgage providers, all of the entire criminal class in America an excuse, a get-out-of-jail-free card. But the next headline, Why America and China Will Clash. And this is from the Financial Times, and Gideon Rachman is arguing that Google withdrawing from China is a sign that this is future trade wars coming between the U.S. and China.
Well, I always had a soft spot for Google. Even though they went into China and they compromised their motto, don't be evil, I knew that someday they would stand up and confront this Leninist dictatorship in China with some principles that are more tuned to what you might call the new economy, which I'm very keen on as a platform for a reinterpretation of democracy around the world. So Google may have set off, however, World War III.
Well, that's what they are arguing here.
Well, that'll be interesting, won't it?
That is.
Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report, Stacy Herbert.
Thank you, Max.
All right, time to go to break. When I come back, I'll be talking with Nomi Prinz. She's the author of It Takes a Pillage: Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. So don't go away.
Life in Russia would be so much brighter if you knew more about someone from first impressions. Meetfriends.rt.com.
Time to welcome to the show Nomi Prinz, former managing director at Goldman Sachs and author of It Takes a Pillage: Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. Welcome to the show, Nomi Prinz.
Thank you so much.
Nomi, you are a former managing director for Goldman Sachs, who, according to its CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, are doing God's work. So I have to ask, did you have to wear a nun's habit to the office?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of doing God's work came in a little bit later. He never really mentioned that when I was there. I think maybe he grew into that role, or thought he did anyway, in his head. But that was not necessarily what we were thinking. It was very much more internally about however one could make money in the given moment, whether it was from a trade, from a client, from a prospective trade, from a very complex derivative asset, whatever it might be. It was really much more the internal motivation rather than, of course, being altruistic or doing God's work in any way.
Well, of course, at Goldman, they were able to turn absolute junk into gold, so I guess that mimics Jesus to some degree. Now, your book is called It Takes a Pillage. Tell us about it.
Well, I wrote the book in the beginning of '09, really after a lot of the bailout and what I call the subsidization, because it wasn't just bailout money that the federal government gave to the industry with capital and actual infusions. It was really very large-scale subsidy of an industry that was about to fall off a cliff. Now, certain firms had fallen off that cliff, like Lehman Brothers, like Bear Stearns, which was acquired by J.P. Morgan Chase, but others were very, very, very close, as a lot of what came out of the crisis indicated. But was a little bit less covered was exactly how much money went into the industry and from what entities in Washington and what conversations predicated that amount of money. And the way I calculated it was, and this was all from public information, just not aggregated in any one place, vis-a-vis Washington, was almost $19 trillion worth at one time. That number is now down to about $13 trillion. Some facilities and ways of subsidies have been closed since the late 08, early 09 period. But a substantial number of trillions of dollars to basically bolster up the very risky practices of a system that went so wrong and lost so much money. And I wanted to get to the bottom of that. So my book's divided into what the Fed did, what the Treasury did, what the banks did, both going into the crisis during the bailout and subsidy period and also since then, and how we've almost forgotten a lot of the lessons learned from that, because a lot of the legislation that's even being vaguely discussed right now doesn't really attack the risk problem that the banking system created and still lives by.
Well, is the window closed for Obama to enact any kind of meaningful reform at this point?
He certainly hasn't enacted meaningful reform, and there certainly hasn't been anything from Congress that has been passed that has been meaningful. I like to hope that the window isn't passed, but unfortunately, when you look at signs like the top 4 CEOs getting in front of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and basically defending their practices, saying, yeah, we made some mistakes, yeah, we didn't know home prices could go down, we were just doing what our clients wanted, we were marking our positions, or depending on the firm, different things were said. And that kind of thing, without a lot of in-depth inquisition, which there wasn't, doesn't even give additional hope to changing the kinds of regulations that we need to really stabilize the system going forward and contain it from the way in which it's doing. So I don't think Obama's done any kind of a job in doing that. Every so often he talks about containing bonuses or containing risk, and they shouldn't go back to risky practices. But the reality is they have.
Yeah, Obama's reaction to the whole crisis seems to be like the typical brokerage customer who gets their monthly statement one month and finds out that they're down 30 or 40%, and they just kind of smack their forehead and say, gee, what happened? You know, he doesn't seem to have a clue as to how these guys work and what the basic operating procedure is on Wall Street, which, as you detail in your work quite exemplary, is a method of more or less accounting fraud and other ways to rape and pillage. And the title of your book, of course, is It Takes a Pillage. Now, in a recent interview with CNBC, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner was at a complete loss to explain the culture of Wall Street. He claimed to have no idea whatsoever how bankers could award themselves such huge bonuses. Can you explain it for us, Nomi Prinz?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, Geithner and such don't really understand the risk that is required to create those kinds of bonuses. We know when the risk went wrong in 2008, bonuses were slightly reduced. We know now in 2009, as banks have been stating their earnings results, that those bonuses are way back above 2007 or pre-crisis levels. But the bonuses aren't even so much about the numbers. They're about the risk that these banks are taking in order to create the trading profits that then underlie those bonuses. And that's the thing that never gets really discussed properly in Washington. You get these like slap type Obama statements about, you know, reckless behavior, but while he's talking, this reckless behavior is continuing, and that is what underlies the bonuses. And there has been no meaningful restraint, not just of the bonuses, because that's just a symptom of the problem of the risk. There's been no meaningful restraint of the risk itself. And that's part of the problem. Today, this year, the revenues that all these major firms that have floated on government capital, that in many cases still do, even when they've repaid TARP, still have access to the Fed window, still have access to cheap loans, still use that access in the past to generate more capital. All of that, most of that goes into trading. It doesn't go into consumer business. It goes into their trading revenues, which we can see at companies like Bank of America, like Citigroup, like J.P. Morgan Chase. They're being carried by trading. They're not being carried by their customer businesses. Mortgages, consumer loans, commercial loans, all of those things continue to erode. That's not the part of the business they're banking on, so to speak, these banks. They're banking on cheap capital behind trading risk to generate profit, and from that to generate really huge bonuses. And that model has not only not changed, it has gotten worse, because now their capital isn't really just coming from the private sector and from their investors. It's coming from public money. It's coming from the opening of the federal government to really subsidize this whole process.
Right. I mean, the connection between bonuses and risk. It's not really what most people assume, that the bank's taking risk and they're being compensated to take risk. No, that's not what's going on at all. The bank are recklessly taking risks, and when the risks go bad, they simply have their losses paid for by the government. So again, it's not a real business model or a banking situation. This is a hostage situation where the banks have taken Geithner, and the Geithner is part of them, of course, so they've taken the American people hostage. And the result has been, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's exactly the case. And while they're doing that, they say they're not. They're having all these conversations about how we can't let too big to fail really be our policy, while it is their policy. They're saying what we need, and this is some of the regulation that's being discussed. It hasn't been passed, but that's the level at which it's being discussed. We should have a better resolution authority, or a procedure that if these big banks start to fail again, we can wind them down or bankrupt them or whatever in an orderly fashion. In other words, once the patient is dead, we can find the gravesite. But not, what do we do in the operating room to make sure that the patient doesn't die so that we don't have to deal with the death or the cost of that death or anything else, which is currently the situation, because there isn't really any discussion about, for example, breaking up the banks, bringing back Glass-Steagall, which was the 1933 act that said, if you're a financial institution and you want to take risk, you want to create securities that are risky, you want to use capital to bet, that's really great. You go do that, but you don't get any federal backing. However, if you're dealing with consumers and you're dealing with the public and you're taking deposits and you're making loans and you're using your capital for that purpose, then, we will back you if there's an economic problem. We will work together as the government. We will have the FDIC, which was created back then to ensure deposits for depositors. But you don't get to do both. And what we have now, and that was largely because of the repeal of that act in 1999, we have a system that has that risk and those deposits tied together in one institution, which is why the federal government will go in and back this risk to save this side. And this risk, again, is what causes the immense problems in the system, as well as perpetuates the bonuses. You don't get the big bonuses from dealing with the boring old consumers.
Right. So
as if you're a bank.
The pushback, of course, from mainstream television in America is that this smacks of wealth redistribution. I think the argument would make more sense if those arguing to break up these big banks would talk about not wealth redistribution by attacking the bonuses, but talking about risk redistribution. That is to say, make these banks take the commensurate amount of risk that goes with taking these enormous bets. If those two things are in sync, then we'd see the banking system and the economy would come closer to balance. But I want to move over to AIG for a second. Geithner also said that the New York Fed paying out 100 cents on the dollar to AIG's counterparties, the principal one being Goldman Sachs, was absolutely the right thing to do. Your thoughts?
Well, everything he thinks he did was right in his mind. This is why he's very dangerous to have as the Treasury Secretary, and why he was dangerous to have as the President of the Fed for the rest of the population, not necessarily for the banking system, who was quite happy about the arrangement. His idea was that, well, we had to pay 100 cents on the dollar out because we didn't have time. There was too chaotic. It was too much of a crisis in the system. If we didn't take care of it right away, if we spent time haggling over things like they're not really worth 100 cents over the dollar, the entire system would have imploded even more quickly and even more destructively, which is just not true. There are everyday negotiations.
They all think they're Jack Bauer, an episode of 24. Now, I want to get to a quick question here. Was the transfer of wealth from taxpayer to Goldman Sachs via the conduit of AIG a crime?
It is a moral and ethical crime. It shouldn't have been done. It shouldn't have been a decision that was undertaken. In terms of the legalities of it, it's harder to say, because AIG is technically classified as a savings and loan. It's technically classified as a bank, even though it's actually a hedge fund that does some insurance. So it sort of was under the umbrella. And Geithner and Bernanke, who was head of the Fed, of course, and will be probably confirmed again this month, is they could, under their mandates, under what they consider emergency powers, do what they consider necessary to do to keep the banking system afloat. Now, should Goldman Sachs, as almost up until the moment before they got the money from AIG and other subsidies from the federal government, they became a bank holding company. They went to the Fed with Morgan Stanley on a Sunday night. They were starving for capital. They were facing bankruptcy. This is something that doesn't get discussed too much. You don't go to the Fed Sunday night when the rest of your industry is imploding if you have enough capital or survive. You change your name, you get the approval, which the Fed gave, did not wait for its general 5-day antitrust period, just said, yeah, okay, go for it. You're bank holding companies. Therefore, you get Fed backing. Therefore, if the federal government is going to save the system, you're now part of that system, the bank holding company system, that can be saved. And AIG is one of your counterparties. They have you and they have contracts amongst each other that have risk behind them that the government will pay for, because that way you'll stay afloat. We're trying to keep AIG afloat because of the relationship with Goldman and every other bank that they were talking about at the time. Of course, Goldman was the major recipient of some of that money, the $12.9 billion worth of it. But from a legal standpoint, those are very murky decisions, and I believe they are the wrong decisions, and they should not have been done. And Goldman had no right to instantaneously become a bank holding company and benefit from 100 cents on the dollar using AIG as the middleman. Those conversations should not have happened.
Well, it's murky by design, and in my view, that's a crime. All right, Naomi Prinz, thank you so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and Naomi Prinz. And if you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. That's Max Keiser. Until next time, saying bye, y'all.